Caribbean Mystery is a 1983 made-for-television film directed by Robert Michael Lewis and was the first film in which Helen Hayes plays Miss Marple. When Miss Marple is vacationing at a Caribbean resort, a fellow guest is murdered, likely because he knew the true identity of another resident of the hotel. With that, Miss Marple begins investigating, in her usual sly, unassuming way. A little while ago, I watched and reviewed what is actually Helen Hayes' second and final Marple film, Murder with Mirrors, released in 1985, which I really enjoyed. The reason for my watching them out of order was given in that video, if you're interested. But, as promised, I doubled back and watched her first performance as the famous spinster sleuth. And first off, let me just say that her performance in Murder with Mirrors, which I loved, was no fluke. She very much steps into the role fully formed, as Marple. That may have been in part due to her playing a character along the same lines a decade earlier in the TV series The Snoop Sisters, but I thought her performance was for the most part quite consistent across the two films. Early on, I think you can detect a hint of her being a somewhat irritable character, getting quietly frustrated with those around her. But thankfully, that doesn't last long, and very soon transitions into being the endearing version of Miss Marple that would continue through the next movie. In those moments where she was slightly grumpy, though, it reminded me of Peter Ustinov's Poirot in Dead Man's Folly, or especially Murder in Three Acts, which I've talked about previously. But once we settle into the movie, she gets a chance to play off a great many cast members, and is really strong in each case. First of all, I wanted to mention Dr. Graham, played by Brock Peters. I think he was great casting and brings a calm, reassuring presence to the middle of the various dramas playing out at the resort. He obviously is very protective of the guests there, and in particular, tries to keep an eye out for Miss Marple, a fact she uses to full advantage. And speaking of that, I very much enjoyed her manipulation of Dr. Graham, which begins almost immediately after the murder takes place. First, she fakes a knee injury to get some alone time with the doctor, and then she begins telling quite the tale about desperately needing a photograph back, which the doctor buys completely. And meanwhile, she's just trying to track down evidence. And then the conversation where she's trying to figure out what should be done in this case. She just can't figure it out, slowly encouraging the doctor to suggest going to the police, a course of action she hadn't even thought of. It's all so blatantly obvious of her, but a lot of fun. And what made it even better was comparing the doctor's reactions to her, which consists of taking her at her word and believing this meek, elderly woman, with that of Leo McKern's detective character in the next movie, where he can see all of her tricks coming and calls them out as such. Something we're shown this time around is the fact that Miss Marple can apparently cast quite the spell over any older man that she comes in contact with, beginning with Major Palgrave, who I don't think I'm spoiling too much by revealing is the murder victim. Palgrave is played by Maurice Evans, and I think he too does a great job. His is not a huge role, but I think he and Helen Hayes have good chemistry. The characters obviously enjoy each other's company. The Major becomes quite taken with her once she first arrives and escorts her around the resort. She gets a sweet scene where she is preparing to meet him for dinner and is getting all dressed up for the evening. But as I said, that little romance doesn't last long because he winds up dead 3 days into the courtship. Which brings me to what was by far my favorite relationship in the movie, that of Miss Marple and Mr. Raphael, played by Barnard Hughes. Mr. Raphael is a wheelchair-bound, cantankerous old man who is not shy about insulting and telling off everyone within earshot. And for everyone but Miss Marple, his bark is just as bad as his bite. When we first meet him, I was sure I was not going to like the character. He just seemed overall too irascible to even be enjoyed, until Miss Marple snaps back at him, and he grouchily admits that he quite likes being talked back to, and she's the only person around who would dare do that. He also sees through her attempts to appear confused and feeble, and whenever Miss Marple is caught in the act, I like it. They continue to share the occasional scene together until he becomes her partner in detection, both trying to figure out what happened. And once that begins, I wish they would have shared even more screen time together, because they're a great deal of fun, and their conversations are filled with humor. The lunch scene where they sit at the end of this long table was great. Raphael keeps shooing others away so they can be alone, but Miss Marple tries to tell him it's helpful to talk to the suspects, which leads to him confessing that she's the only person at the resort that he likes. Also in the movie is Jameson Parker, who I, and probably most people know best as A.J. Simon from Simon & Simon. This movie was actually made right in the middle of that series' run. I like him in Simon & Simon quite a bit, and I think his performance here isn't that far off from the usual from him. Which is to say, he's a pretty lightweight actor, and there are a couple of scenes in this movie where it shows. He's playing one of the owners of the resort, and he's supposed to be stressed out by the increasing debt, the guests fleeing after the murder, and he's not always convincing, but otherwise he's alright. His character does bring out some of that irritability in Miss Marple when he's constantly trying to organize lawn games or activities for the guests. And Marple is consistently skilled at inventing some medical reason why she should have to sit this one out. Susan Hubley plays his wife, and I thought she was very good. She definitely has the standout dramatic role in the film, becoming more and more unstable throughout the movie. Zakes Moquet plays Captain Daventry, the local police officer who ends up involved after Miss Marple urges Dr. Graham to pay him a visit. His and Dr. Graham's first scene was a lot of fun, as was the scene where Daventry meets with Miss Marple, and none too subtly suggests that she could be a potential next victim. The possibility of that happening almost seems pleasing to him. The mystery of the story is quite good, and it's a fun reveal when you realize that a potential next murder is imminent, and if Palgrave was to be believed, would be a husband killing his wife. And you look at the list of suspects, and suddenly the fact that the resort seems almost entirely populated by unhappy married couples comes into focus. Again, as most of these TV movies do, I think it does a pretty good job of utilizing its location, here being all the various bungalows and rooms that make up the resort. It does feel very tied to staying there, which makes sense, that's the story, but the fact that so often the guests are just lazily sitting around does make it feel a little confining. The movie as a whole does feel a lot more like an 80s TV show than most of the others I've reviewed so far. The camera work is pretty flat and every scene is overlit, so it doesn't have the atmosphere of the foggy grounds and overcast skies of Murder with Mirrors. And whereas last time the fact that it was set in the 80s didn't really affect the look or feel of the movie, this one does have an abundance of dated hairstyles and costumes, especially bathing suits or other assorted loungewear. And without sounding like I'm complaining too much, it does feel more slowly paced than the second movie did. Most of these movies really fly by for me, but this one did drag a little in a few places. That might come down to, as I was saying, the characters largely just hanging around the resort, seemingly waiting for something to happen, but it is only 88 minutes or so it doesn't really overstay its welcome. But there are still plenty of fun moments, and it felt unique from its sequel. Both of them sort of fall into two subgenres for murder mysteries. This one being the vacationing detective with a group of strangers as suspects, and Murder with Mirrors, the large, dysfunctional family in an old house together. So the brief Helen Hayes era of Miss Marple does have two very different stories. I think it would have been great if she could have done a few more. As I've said a few times at this point, she is a great Miss Marple. One quick scene I hadn't mentioned yet is her little run to get her knitting at one point. That scene alone kind of sums up the portrayal that we're getting, and it's one I really enjoy. I'd recommend it. Just a quick note, I picked up the Joan Hickson series lately, which it seems is a lot of people's favorites in terms of Miss Marple adaptations, so I'm looking forward to delving into that and comparing her versions of these two stories once I get there. Thanks so much for watching my review. If you enjoyed it, please check back to my channel as I'll be covering more Agatha Christie adaptations very soon. Thanks again, and adios for now.